Tantor Audio, a division of recorded books, presents The Story of the Country House, A History of Places and People, by Clive Aslet, narrated by Simon Vance. Introduction. Eric Ponsonby, 10th Earl of Bessborough, loved Stanstead Park. This was something of a surprise to his friends, since the house near Chichester was rebuilt after a fire in the Edwardian period, and in the early 1980s, Edwardian architecture was regarded with scorn. I disagreed. Yale University Press had just published my book, The Last Country Houses, a study of country houses from 1890 to 1939, which was why he asked me, as an eager young architectural historian, to help him revise his book about it, A Place in the Forest. Eric's partiality sometimes got the better of him, yet how nice it would be to believe, as he did, that Roman legionaries really had once tramped down the long avenue. Outwardly, Stanstead may have been Edwardian, but, like many country houses, it was more than that. For at least 800 years, the people who owned it, a colourful crowd, rarely related to each other since they were singularly bad at producing heirs, had been nurturing, reimagining, and loving it perhaps as much as Eric did. Standing in immemorial forest, the first Stanstead was used by Henry II as a hunting lodge in the late 12th century. In 1480, the 12th Earl of Arundel replaced the lodge with a sprawling mansion in the ultra-fashionable material of brick. This building suffered a small bombardment during the Civil War and subsequently decayed, so that all that now survives from Lord Arundel's time is a fragment of rose-coloured brick on the outside of the chapel. In the 1680s, a new Stanstead arose on a different site nearby, with a hipped roof, dormers and pediment for the first Earl of Scarborough, a favourite of Charles II and one of the statesmen who invited William III to the throne. The following century saw the levelling of the formal gardens to make a landscape park, the construction of a triangular tower by the second Earl of Halifax in 1772, and the arrival of yet another owner, the East India Company merchant and MP Richard Barwell, who made it his study to render himself obnoxious to persons of all ranks, according to a diarist, by shutting up the park. Barwell also remodelled the house. On Barwell's death in 1804, Stanstead was bought by Lewis Way, who would have become a clergyman if his father had not made him study law. After working for a wealthy but unrelated client who shared his surname, Lewis Way found he had been left £30,000. A member of the London Society for Promoting Christianity Among the Jews, Way transformed Stanstead into a college where young, impecunious Jews could stay, be shaved and baptized, and train as missionaries to be sent to their own people. A donkey-riding school prepared them for travel in distant lands. It was Way who made the chapel out of surviving fragments of the Tudor house. During the 3-hour service of consecration, the poet John Keats had ample time to study the stained glass in the north windows, where the arms of the Earls of Arundel inspired a stanza of The Eve of St. Agnes. In 1840, the exuberant Thomas Hopper built a stone conservatory for the new owner, a port wine merchant called Charles Dixon, who founded an almshouse for 6 of his less successful brethren. Then, on the last day of the 1900 Goodwood races, Stanstead caught fire in a blaze that lit up the country for miles around. Carvings by Grinling Gibbons, Italian ceiling paintings, pictures of the queens who were supposed to have slept there, all were destroyed. Stanstead was rebuilt in an unexciting Neo-Georgian style. This was the house bought by the 9th Earl of Bessborough in 1924, after Bessborough House in Ireland was burnt during the Troubles. Fortunately, its contents had already been removed, and some of its beautiful 18th-century pictures still hang at Stanstead today. Bessborough asked his old Cambridge friend, the architect Harry Goodhart Rendell, to come down in his Rolls-Royce and bring his new home up to date. The Sainte-Chapelle in Paris inspired a blue chapel ceiling spangled with stars, and Rinaldo, as the architect was known, built a theatre modelled on the Duchess Theatre in London, which fired the young Eric with a passion for acting. In 1942, while watching a training film, a member of the Home Guard dropped a cigarette and the theatre went up in flames. This book is an introduction to the history of places like Stansted. Stansted itself illustrates one of the difficulties of the subject. It went through so many iterations. Even country houses that strongly evoke a single period are often palimpsests, where one era overwrites another, a process that may happen again and again until the deep past is no more than a ghostly, indecipherable smudge. The same place wears different guises. There is continuity in the place and idea of the country house, but the Stansted of today is nothing like the original hunting lodge. However, the long history of country houses like Stansted is a considerable part of their fascination. They are a document on which is written their owners' changing lives, tastes, and sources of income. Generally, I shall touch on only one aspect of the houses I discuss, but many, like Stansted, were altered in almost every generation. All of which prompts the question, what is a country house? That is not so easy to answer. The meaning changes depending on the historical period being discussed. Like castle, the single word we have in English to represent numerous more specialized terms in medieval Latin texts, country house is a catch-all. Chatsworth, in all its princely splendour, is a country house, but so is hand-crafted Munstead wood. Mighty Alnwick Castle in the wilds of Northumberland, yes, that's undoubtedly a country house. Politely Georgian Kenwood House on the edge of Hampstead Heath, most people would call that one, too. Historians used to think of a country house as being a gentleman's residence in the centre of a landed estate. Rents from the tenanted farms that made up the estate paid for the house. It was a sealed and largely self-sufficient system, or that was the idea. That was the definition I was told to use when I began to write architectural articles in Country Life in the 1970s. These were the seats of gentlemen or peers, a word that conveyed settled occupation and the probability of a family vault in the parish church. However, this definition does not completely hold water. In the Middle Ages, noblemen and women did possess seats, the place where the family had come from and members were buried. But there was nothing settled about their way of life. They were always on the move between castles, manor houses, and hunting lodges. That is when they were not following the court, which was similarly peripatetic, or on campaign. Land was immensely important to them, but the homes through which they passed were hardly what we would think of as country houses. Indeed, the idea of a rural retreat would have seemed strange in a land whose towns and cities were tiny. Later, the great Tudor and Jacobean courtiers spent prodigiously on lavish building projects, sometimes ruining themselves in the process. They were loss leaders to impress the monarch, their cost unrelated to the income of the estate. Others built in places that were convenient for the court or the great money pot of the City of London. The suburbs of London have since swallowed them up. They were places of recreation, umbilically linked to the town. With the agricultural depression that began in the 1870s and lasted until the Second World War, the link between country house and landed estate was pretty well severed. Land ceased to be the reliable and productive investment it had seemed since the dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century. If Edwardian country house builders wanted land, it was not because they thought it would finance their running costs. Rather, it conferred status, and you could hunt and shoot on it. But most people after 1900 did not want much land at all. Lutyens built his numerous country houses for clients who were looking for a different way of life from the stuffy, hidebound circles associated with Edward VII and George V. The country life definition did not apply, although paradoxically nearly all of Lutyens's houses were published by Country Life. After the Second World War, Many new country houses did have land, because they were built by landowners who were downsizing from monster houses to more manageable ones built on the same site. Since the 1980s, however, when traditional landowners have been outnumbered in these stakes by hedge fund managers and the owners of .com, life science and new technology companies, land has been viewed differently. Field sports continue, but rewilding has come up the agenda. Immense estates have been assembled in the Highlands for this purpose, and nobody expects a Highland estate to make money. This discussion has left out a species of country house that had a different name altogether, the villa. Villas were originally caprices, small, highly architectural buildings on the outskirts of towns, which could be visited for the day. In the 18th century, they became more permanent dwellings. These days, many new country houses are of villa size and dependent on easy access to the city where the wealth that created them was made. Villas must have a place in this story, as do hunting lodges and the medieval hideaways known as pleasaunces. They have more in common with a 21st century country house than the first Duke of Marlborough's Blenheim Palace or 19th century Penrhyn Castle, built for a slate quarry owner using money derived partly from his cousin's 6 slave-run sugar estates in Jamaica. My definition of the country house is this: a work of domestic architecture in a rural location, surrounded by its own land, although not necessarily a landed estate, and intended to seem a self-contained unit, its own little kingdom, as 19th century writers liked to call it. It is not a working entity like a farmhouse, although work may be done from it. The inhabitants value it for many things: love of the land, status, self-expression through architecture, and, not least, the pleasure to be had there, with gardens, horses, dogs, art, collecting. Delete as applicable. It has probably been made into a mini Arcadia, where owner and loved ones can find refuge from a harsh or giddy world. Size is not the issue. The country house is an idea, and it changes with each generation. This will be a narrative history, covering the whole of the British Isles. I confess that England plays a larger part than Scotland, Wales or Ireland, but this is unavoidable from the Middle Ages onwards. It was economically dominant. Its peasants could produce a surplus, however modest, because of the kinder climate, while those of the other countries struggled to subsist. This meant that English landowners could collect more rent. They could also keep more sheep, at a time when wool was one of the few internationally traded commodities. English kings owned parts of France, and while they often had to fight expensive wars to keep or regain them, victory could yield a bonanza, as towns were sacked and the booty distributed among the leaders of the winning side. There was simply more money to spend on domestic architecture in England, with a special incentive to build around London, where the results would be seen by people of influence. Of course, the individual histories of the different countries of the British Isles make it impossible always to treat them as a single geographical unit. Ireland was a colony, Scotland a separate kingdom. Wales was conquered by Edward I at the end of the 13th century, but its princes and warlords did not take occupation lying down. Integration with England only came under the Tudors. These countries had their own architectural traditions which lasted into the 18th century, before, in the case of Scotland, being revived. The regional strands are spun together after the Scottish Act of Union of 1707, when Scotland was joined to England and Wales, and the Irish Act of Union of 1801, when the United Kingdom was formed. Southern Ireland won independence after the First World War. Inevitably, then, there are differences, but also shared features. Regional traditions merged with the architectural mainstream during the Georgian period, and local singularities became a matter of nuance. By the late 18th century, the same architects were being used throughout Britain, and their clients travelled, visiting other country houses as they did so. They may have owned several houses themselves. It is notable how many distinguished country house architects were Scottish. The story of the British country house reaches out further still, beyond its immediate locality, to embrace a wider world. Richard Barwell's fortune derived from India. Charles Dickson made his money in the wine trade. The Bessboroughs had estates in Ireland, and Lewis Way took a particular interest in the Holy Land. These places of retreat had global connections. Trade, war, and empire provided the resources to build them. Only the very rich could afford the luxury of a country house, but modern historians increasingly recognize that behind them and their architects stood dozens, if not hundreds of others, labouring on the land, in counting houses, down mines, on men of war, in cotton mills, sweating in the cantonments of India, or enslaved on the sugar plantations of the West Indies. Without these usually anonymous toilers, there would not have been the money to make the country house possible. The story is not for the faint-hearted. Owners amassed or inherited enormous wealth, often through what can now seem to be inordinate, grasping ambition, riding roughshod over both their political rivals and the poor on their estates, whose miserable existence stood in signal contrast to their own splendour. There were exceptions. Some landlords could be kind, but even they could ignore what to us seemed the glaring moral iniquities of the ultimate sources of their fortunes. Slavery is an obvious example. The connections of this shocking evil with the Georgian economy are now receiving much scrutiny. Alas, it is not the only form of human exploitation whose fruits were the country house. Coal mining was an immense source of wealth, but the consequences, we might think, were as bad for the environment as they were for the lungs of the miners engaged in it. Medieval serfdom was little better than slavery, and where, in the hierarchy of past sins, should we place the sacking of towns by soldiers eager for booty, the marriage of 12-year-old heiresses to middle-aged men for the sake of their inheritance, or the imperial adventurers known as landlords, Cecil Rhodes's friends, rich from the gold fields and diamond mines of South Africa, and chief flag-wavers for the Boer War? Were those who did not directly commit abuses against fellow human beings complicit by failing to condemn them? These are deep questions. I believe we should beware of attempting to retrofit modern morals onto previous eras of history which operated according to different codes. The past, as L.P. Hartley famously wrote, is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Few areas of study better exemplify that observation than the country house. Historical research reveals how dissimilar, sometimes radically so, past lives, expectations, religious convictions, and social mores could be from our own. Before passing judgment on men and women who lived prior to our own supposedly enlightened times, should we not pause to reflect on the globalized economy of today? Jane Austen's England did not morally confront the source of its sugar, West Indian plantations run by slaves, which seems unforgivable. But how many people in our own age can be sure of the conditions in which the rare minerals needed for electric car batteries are mined, cheap garments made, or the parts of their mobile phones produced? Slavery exists in the supply chain of nearly every business, according to the investment manager's CCLA. The past may not be such a foreign country after all. The story of the country house is not only male. Even in the Middle Ages, some women, widows, abbesses, could be rich and independent. They might also have been educated to a high standard in convents, an opportunity generally denied to girls after the dissolution of the monasteries. Bess of Hardwick, Lady Anne Clifford, and Sarah, Duchess of Marlborough, were all builders. Wives like the Jacobean Lady Leal at Penshurst supervised architectural works and estates, while their husbands were away at court, in the army, or making their fortunes overseas. During the English Civil War this could extend to defending the country house against siege, which the Puritan Brilliana, Lady Harley, did with great spirit, even though the privations killed her. Men may have generally taken the big decisions on architecture, landscape, collecting, and furniture, subjects that they discussed in their clubs without female involvement, but some couples, like the first Marquis and Marchioness of Lansdowne at Bowood, did everything together. Women were likely to spend more time in the country than their menfolk, whether they liked it or not. One thinks of Lady Leicester, stuck in the building site of Holkham Hall, while her husband, the first Earl, pursued a quasi-bachelor life in London. Country houses have always been family places. Today they are often acquired by couples when they start to have children. Owners in the past were family-minded in a different way. They saw country houses as dynastic seats, and wives underwent a constant round of pregnancies to produce heirs. One reason that babies were put out to be breastfed by countrywomen was to allow the mother to conceive again as quickly as possible. There were no women architects to speak of before the 20th century. Society would have frowned on unaccompanied site visits and client meetings, and it would have been difficult to go up scaffolding in long skirts. But feminine influence inside the country house cannot be overlooked. The wife ran the household, bottling fruit, dispensing homemade medicines, ensuring that epic deliveries of raw ingredients for the kitchen were properly stored, that carpets were beaten and copper pans scoured. Modern historians are apt to regard needlework, shell grottos, or creations such as the feather hangings that the blue-stocking Elizabeth Montagu worked at her Berkshire country house, Sandalford Priory, the subject of a poem by William Cowper, as unacceptably gendered. However, such ladies' work, as a previous generation of historians called it, not only occupied hours of labour, but softened the appearance of the home. At the end of the 19th century, Lutyens's career would be unimaginable without the help of the craftswoman and gardener, Gertrude Jekyll. As well as requiring a multitude of workers to create the wealth from which they were built, country houses themselves contained large numbers of people. That was the point of them. Before 1600, a noble retinue might run to hundreds of people. At one party in 1732, the future Marquis of Rockingham welcomed about 1,000 guests, serving them 225 dishes. It was part of a strategy to keep Yorkshire on the side of the Whigs. No wonder he rebuilt Wentworth Woodhouse with the longest facade of any country house in Britain. The connection between politics and country houses continued into the Jet Age, with Harold Macmillan still cultivating the impression of governing Britain from a grouse moor in the 1960s. Country house weekends provided a forum for conversation. Deals could be done away from the general gaze, and bonds cemented between the owner and guests, be they from the surrounding neighbourhood, the county town, or London. Until the Second World War, noblesse oblige required traditional landowners to throw huge parties for their eldest son's coming of age and other dynastic events. They were at the centre of what the Middle Ages called an affinity, and the Georgian period a connection. We might call it a social group or community. In the medieval period, this was expressed in the Great Hall. Today, the ubiquitous live-in kitchen is another multi-purpose space where what, until a quite recent date, would have been regarded as a highly private activity, the preparation of food, is thrown open to public view. By public, though, I mean that of a small group of family and friends. For people now buy or build country houses to be private. Indeed, the story of the country house could be told as a journey towards the modern ideal of privacy. We live in a society that is anxious to protect data, preserve personal space, and escape, in the case of celebrities, paparazzi and mobile phone cameras. Privacy has always been a luxury, but now is more important to us than ever. If there is one place it can be found, it is in the country house. There are no passers-by, and probably few guests, to judge from the small number of bedrooms in most new country houses. We do not always remember how odd our privacy fetish would have seemed to other ages. For most of history, country house owners lived in close, sweaty proximity to other people on whom they relied for the necessities of existence. Before the 18th century, servants routinely slept outside bedroom doors. How else would they know to be available when called, before the proliferation of the wired bell pull in the Regency? It was only at their devotions that people were alone, and then they had God for company. Complete solitude might even have seemed frightening. But magnates still longed to escape the crowds of retainers who surrounded them. Medieval kings built fancifully named hideaways to which they could retreat with loved ones or a few chosen friends, and the servants who would look after them. 18th-century gentlemen found seclusion in the follies of their landscape parks. On the edge of Ullswater, in the Lake District, the 11th Duke of Norfolk built Lyulph's Tower as an escape from Greystoke Castle, which was itself considerably smaller and more remote than his main seat of Arundel Castle, on which he spent heavily. Several country house owners, particularly in Ireland, built tunnels so they could avoid contact with their servants. In the 20th century, washing machines, vacuum cleaners and dishwashers made it possible for owners to live more independently of staff. Butlers are supposed to have become more plentiful in this age of billionaires, but few new country houses are equipped for many staff to live in. Neither employers nor employees want to return to the below-stairs world of the Edwardian era. Privacy is closely guarded by both. Country houses are inherently fragile, depending on the success of their owners in keeping them going. The destruction of the country house exhibition in 1974 revealed that well over 1,000 had been demolished over the previous century. There have been other waves of destruction. During the English Civil War, which engulfed all parts of the British Isles, castles and country houses that were not wrecked in fighting were deliberately blown up or slighted to prevent them from being strongholds in the future. Extravagance, racehorses, gambling, and bad marriages have also brought ruin in their wake. The first Duke of Chandos's princely Canons Park in Middlesex lasted a mere 23 years after its completion, before the second Duke broke it up. Close to London, Canons was built to show off the first Duke's artistic taste and inordinate wealth. When Duke and wealth were gone, it had no purpose. Hamilton Palace in Lanarkshire, begun in 1695, was not finished by the 10th Duke of Hamilton, Il Magnifico, or as one writer called him, the very Duke of very Dukes, until 1842. But the contents were sold in 1884, the country house undermined to extract coal, and demolished in 1921. The vagaries of inheritance meant that some owners possessed too many homes for their needs. When the 6th Duke of Devonshire succeeded his father in 1811, he had 8. They all survived his tenure, but the 4th Earl of Dysart, that miserly old curmudgeon, as Horace Walpole called him, demolished 2 of the 4 properties that came to him, Harrington Hall in Northamptonshire and Woody Hall in Cheshire, both reputed gems. Terraces were levelled, gardens ploughed up, fruit walls torn down. He kept Ham House outside London and Helmingham Hall in Suffolk. Past losses can be lamented, but in recent decades the country house has revived. Often owners have built on sites of demolished mansions to take advantage of the opportunities for planning permission as well as the mature landscape. This is a story of resurrection as well as death. There is also the subject, not to be forgotten if less fashionable than it once was, of taste. As Andrew Boord, the first English writer to discuss the architecture of houses, wrote in 1554, "For the commodious building of a place doth not only satisfy the mind of the inhabitor, but also it doth comfort and rejoiceth a man's heart to see it, specially the pulchro's prospect." Pulchritude is in the eye of the beholder, and in their hunt for beauty owners did not always follow the pack. This point must be emphasized, lest the story told here creates an impression of inevitability in the onward march of style. Country house aesthetics do not only move forward. Here, of all places, owners could suit themselves. It is impossible not to notice how many of them wanted to evoke the glories of an idealized past. The late country house historian John Cornforth used to call this the backward look. Owners might diverge from the mainstream of taste to create places of special meaning to themselves that expressed religious belief, a nostalgia for the age of chivalry, an assertion of ancient lineage.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?